Texas government. How's everybody doing today? I'm on the campus of Eastfield College, conveniently bringing to you this Texas government experience. Weather's beautiful outside. It's absolutely fabulous. So thrilled to be back, students. It's Monday, and I need for you to take good notes and get ready, okay? I'm going to carry you for at least 40 minutes today, okay? So get your pen, paper, whatever you need to do to retain and take notes, okay? So let's walk, just as a point of order. Students, I still have some students out there struggling, one or two, to access the textbook, and hopefully you all have access. But once you see the Dr. Newman book, Glenn Newman, the American Government book, you're in the right place. You just got to figure out how to open those chapters and just go in and click lecture materials, and that'll take you to the chapters. So also the numbers of the chapters, don't get confused. Just look at the subject matter. Like, for example, on the syllabus, I need for you to look at subject, because the sequence of chapters may be slightly off. Like the syllabus says chapter 15, but once you go into lecture material, it shows chapter 14, but the title of the chapter is still the same. So last week, let me just discuss title. I don't want you getting stuck on the number of the chapter. The titles I need for you to pay attention to. Last week, you were responsible for the Texas Constitution, that reading. Regardless of what that number said, you read the Texas Constitution chapter. The second chapter was Texas political culture. And the third, which is not in the book, it's federalism. So I'm going to unpack all three of those chapters today, okay? Then this week, moving to second week, you are responsible for interest groups, which should show chapter 21. And then types of elections, that's chapter 19. So you read those two chapters this week, interest groups and types of elections. So now I want to walk through, I'm going to get as far as I can with each one of those chapters I just described. Now, last week, students, you had some success. You got through last week. Let's move on through this week. You accomplished quite a bit last week. I need for you to follow that same discipline. Log in daily. Watch my videos. Take good notes. And so, students, you're in it now. You know the discipline and the expectation of this course. So let's move on through. The Texas Constitution. What's the purpose of the Texas Constitution? Students, I want you to think about it in this context. There are 4 points in your textbook, and I'm going to break down each point. The purpose of the Constitution, the 4 points, are it accommodates government with legitimacy. So government will not have legitimacy if there was not a written document called the Texas Constitution. And also that legitimacy essentially means power and authority to operate, okay? So in a litigious environment, litigation, going to court, the court proceedings, the consistency of those questions will always be, what gave you the power to do what you do? It's through the document of the Constitution that gives government officials legitimacy. Second thing, creates and organizes government with different functions and keeps it organized. Which branch will do, it's 3 branches, executive, judicial, and legislative. Each branch has a distinct function. One branch cannot start operating like another branch. In other words, the judiciary cannot start operating like the executive branch. It needs to be a separation of powers and functionality. So it creates and organizes government in a purposeful, functional way. And notice it did not say efficiency. Notice it did not say effectiveness. It just says creates and organizes government. Efficiency and effectiveness, that's a whole different component of government under governance. Third is gives government the necessary power to operate. So the Constitution, in the example of policing, students, when you call 911, the governor will not come, okay? The state troopers will not come. The reason why is the power of policing has been delegated through the Texas Constitution down to local municipal government to respond to that 911 call. So that's who's held accountable to save your life. The accountability, once you call 911, again, the United States president is not coming. The governor or state troopers, state police, they're not coming because they were not given the power through the Texas Constitution to respond to you. Fourth is that it restricts government. And what this means with restricts government, this is the Constitution protects its people from its own government. In other words, students, government can use its powers against its own people. Government can use its resources against its own people. But the Constitution of the Texas has it that you restrict government power from doing harm and abuse using government power and resources against its own people. See, that's what's occurring, students, in other governments outside of the U.S. Other governments, many have historically used their own power and resources to suppress down or hurt or harm, even kill its own people. Again, government's function is to serve. It's service. So can you imagine government using its power and function against its own people? So in terms of power to operate, municipal government and statute, Texas statute, which are laws, you have the constitutional framework, and then you have statutes of Texas, and this breaks down in a very narrow, special, defined areas of government, such as municipal corporation. What does that mean? That basically means these are all your local cities. And local cities have different rules of governing. Like local cities doesn't have legislation. They have what's called ordinances. So an ordinance is your local city law, just very, very similar to a piece of legislation. But legislation is used at the state level for laws. So if you ever hear the term, students, I went through the 4 L's with you, but if you ever hear the term public policy at the state level, law and legislation, I'm referring to the same thing. But when you drop down to cities, city halls, they don't call their laws legislation. They call their laws ordinances. So, and then the city is governed by the city charter, but the city must also comply with legislative law and Texas constitutional law. So you have this, cities essentially have to comply with 4 different laws: city charter, ordinance, there are actually more than 4, state legislation, federal law. There are four. So cities have to comply with those four, and of course the state constitution. So let me repeat that again. State constitution, city charter, city ordinance, state of Texas legislative law, and federal law. There is actually five. Okay. So go back and rewind that and make sure that there are five. So municipal corporation, those are all your cities. That's your first level of government serving the people. State of Texas regulates many aspects of cities, okay? Primarily in the area of water, education, and those are the main two, water and education. Let me share with you an evolution over time dating back to 1836. So this window of time from 1836 to our current Texas Constitution was adopted in 1876. So just kind of follow me. I'm going to go back. I'm going to take you back to 1836. What was going on in Texas at the time? Texas declared their independence from Mexico in 1836. Then in 1845, Texas Constitution. 1836 was the first Texas Constitution. 1845, the abolition of slavery was declared. Constitution was amended, declaring slaves free in the state of Texas. Then 1866, Texas amended its constitution to establish a line item veto for the governor. In other words, this is a method that's used in the state legislature to essentially adopt certain laws and rules. 1869, this was the time period of the Radical Republicans. And the Radical Republicans, this is a time period after the Civil War to reconstruct this broken country that was basically divided with Civil War. So after the Civil War ended, then there was a period of rebuilding our country. And so rebuilding, you've heard the term reconstruction. That was the period to rebuild our nation back from the ruins and destruction of the Civil War. And so the Radical Republicans, listen to the irony here, students. Texas currently is a predominant Republican state. But back during the time of 1869, Texas was predominantly a Democratic Party controlled state. And so in 1869, there was a group called the Radical Republicans, and they were primarily African Americans who, after the Civil War, they established quite a political footing and control of state government during that time of 1869. And they were known as the Radical Republicans. Well, the Radical Republicans were very, very powerful in the state. They had an influence on the independent state of Texas. This is before state of Texas actually became a member of the United States of America. You remember the founding of the U.S. Constitution was through 13 states. And then other states started to join into the United States of America, the Union. And so Texas was one during the Radical Republican time period of 1869, where the Radical Republicans were influential with lobbying Washington, D.C., from the state of Texas, lobbying Washington, D.C., to get on the agenda, state of Texas on the agenda to become considered, voted in through Washington, D.C. for the state of Texas to join the other states in the United States of America. And so currently, the current Constitution was adopted in 1876. So now you have from 1836, 1845, 1866, 1869, and 1876. Those were the time periods and years for the evolution of the Texas Constitution. So now I'd like to shift, have a conversation with you about specifically an item in the Texas Constitution called a bicameral system. Essentially, what does bicameral system mean? That is a system that's established by our Constitution of how proposed bills, ultimately becomes law in the state of Texas. Specifically, in a bicameral system, you have the House side, which is Congress, and the other side, in a bicameral system, you have the state Senate. For a bill to become law, that bill must go through a bicameral. Both House and Senate must be approved by the House and the Senate, and ultimately become law. So you must have voter approval, your L's, by the legislature, the body, okay, to ultimately become law. And then the third step is on the governor's desk for signature. That's after approval by the House and the Senate. So if one side, Senate or Congress, House, does not approve the bill, then what, students? It fails. It does not become the law and never makes it to the governor's desk. So in a bicameral system, you need both houses to approve a proposed law. Now, earlier, before 1876, so 1876 is the current Constitution, which requires a bicameral system. But Texas has not always been a bicameral system. It started as a state as a unicameral system, which meant one house would approve a bill to become law. And then it evolved from a unicameral, one side, to a bicameral system, which is two sides, House and the Senate. Also, I want to share with you the state of Texas budget, students, is adopted just as the state legislature meets every 2 years. And that term for every 2 years is a biennium. Biennium, Biennial. It's essentially biennial. Biennial. That means every 2 years. So every 2 years, the state of Texas adopts its state budget. Every 2 years, the state legislature meets, and this is spelled out in the Constitution, that our state has a biennial budget. So biennial does not mean every 12 months. It means every 24 months, okay? So moving on, students. Political culture is the next chapter. Political culture, students, just essentially means population shifts in Texas, demographic shifts in Texas. Brown, Latin, African Americans, white individuals, Asian individuals, whatever the racial makeup or ethnic makeup may be in the state of Texas, it quantifies and gives a percentage of the population. Now, Texas is currently going through a population shift with increased data increased population growth related to members of the brown community. And I hate to use color to refer, and also this racial context. We'll touch on race in a moment, but essentially, race is a construct that before the construct of race, persons hadn't always been referred to as racial groups. The founding of America was based on a class system, and a class system is out of Europe. Great Britain contributed to the shaping of the Texas Constitution. And it's through a class system. Colonization, colonies, is through a class system, not a race system, which is totally separate. The racial construct is, frankly, about 250 years old. But prior to that, there's been a class system. So let me say it a different way. A class system is such that based on your pedigree in society or your lineage in society, that determines what type of class, your wealth, your income, your family lineage, your history, your identity was a part of class. Race is a fairly new construct. And so classism is based on pedigree. Racism and race, there's so many connotations that come out of the grouping based on color, and is often associated with the ism of racism. But the miseducation out there, students, is that there's a miseducated narrative about race and racism. First of all, racism, students, and this conversation will hopefully create a greater understanding for you, to where whenever you hear the term racism, you rethink it. Because I want to be clear, the race or grouping of persons based on race evolved into the ism, the construct or the narrative of isms, sexism, classism, genderism. I mean, the isms just go on, but the most predominant is sexism and racism. But to be clear, students, you can have racism within the same grouping of people that look just like each other. For example, African Americans. You can be a racist against another African American. And it's based on this false narrative dealing with groupings of people based on skin color. Another African American can suppress down another African American within the same race, just as a member of the Latin community can suppress down another member of the Latin community, and you're within the same culture. All groups from Venezuela, some groups can suppress down another group. Cuba, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, within the same group who look just like each other. Members of the white community can suppress down other whites who look the same way. So this construct of racism, racism is a fairly 250 plus year construct. Prior to that, it was class system. Around the world, class system. Racism was born out of a construct from the slave trade. Okay? The slave trade originated not in America. America just fueled it and grew it. But slave trade did not start in America. Slave trade was started by Dutch, Portuguese, and Spain. They're the ones that owned the ships to transport. America did not own any ships to transport slaves. Slavery grew in America and became what the history shows as slavery. But prior to slaves coming into American ports, it was a class and a caste system. That system was not based on race. So students understand there's a lot of history based on, if ever you hear the term isms, racism, I want you to rethink it, because you can have one race that's racist against another race. But you can also have people that look just alike, racist against someone who looks just like them. So please understand that dynamic. It's a very emotional topic. It can be misunderstood, misread, and miseducated. But with respect to political culture, there is a shifting of ethnicity and culture in Texas, specifically with the growing population of the Latino community. And please be aware, students, there are many Latin countries of where persons of the brown community originate. So when they come to Texas, they bring many different cultures with them. And the question becomes, how is Texas adapting as a state to govern other populations that's growing? Is the political climate changing in Texas? The answer is yes. Are voting patterns changing in Texas? The answer is yes. Will Texas always remain a Republican state? The answer is the history shows Texas started as a strong Democratic state. It later became a strong Republican state, and the evolution will continue. Okay? So, students, I know I'm hitting you with a lot, but I need for you to take good notes on this, because understand the history of the Texas Constitution and also understand population shifts in Texas. So the next topic I'd like to cover is federalism. Federalism, you've heard of the Federalists, and the Federalists were a part of shaping and influencing the U.S. Constitution, and ultimately down to state constitutions. Well, the Federalists, I know you've heard, and I don't want to complicate it for you, but I'm going to keep it real simple and understandable and relatable for you. The Federalists, and keep in mind, during the 1776 time period, before the states were united, there were 13 states, and those states, again, before the United States of America and before the adoption of the 1776 Constitution. And so keep in mind, from 1776, the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, and I've already shared with you, 100 years later, 1876, was the Texas Constitution. So Texas is relatively new as a state. But prior to the adoption of the federal Constitution in 1776, I want you to remember, students, the two conflicts at that time was territory and taxation. So point being is the Federalists believed in their original position of the Federalists. They believed in strong central government, that's the founding of the federal government, and weaker state government. And so keep in mind, they're coming from the context of states were trying to be strong, and you had no federal central government. So the Federalists said, no, we need to have a strong federal functioning government. And federal government needs to control the states, and we need to have weaker state government. So kind of follow me here, students. Some 450 years later, there's still a U.S. Constitution has an amendment called the 10th Amendment. And that amendment is known as the States Amendment, which all that essentially means is whatever action the federal government does not take in terms of public policy, in other words, the federal government in action never established a public policy to govern 50 states, then the 10th Amendment slips in to say if the federal government took no action, there's no federal policy, then let's kick that responsibility over to the states. Let states decide their own laws under state sovereignty, how they want to govern this particular topic. And you remember, federal government, they took no action, no public policy. Pass that baton down to states. So currently, how does that impact you today? Abortion is one. Federal government, Supreme Court, removed Roe v. Wade, which means what? No action, no uniformity, no control by the federal government related to abortion over 50 states. That then opened up the opportunity under the 10th Amendment for the states to establish 50 different state legislative laws dealing with abortion. So that's how federalism is applicable today. The contradictory narrative here is, you remember, students, originally the Federalist intent was strong central government, weaker state government. But with the example I just gave you with abortion, it's contradictory. Now it's reality on the ground is stronger state government, weaker federal government, because the federal government did not act and preserve Roe v. Wade. Federal government ended Roe v. Wade. Same example holds true for voting. Voting after the Civil War, Country was divided, Reconstruction. After the Civil War, voting registration went through the roof. African Americans were voted into office in high numbers. And then during that same time period, states, there was no federal law to protect voting. No federal law during that time period. So for about 100 years, state laws prevailed and said, no, we're not going to allow all this voting from all these different groups of individuals, primarily African American. So states developed, state legislatures, primarily in the South, developed their own legislative rules related to voting. Two rules were literacy tests, in which you had to take a test before you could vote. You were eligible to vote. And the second was a poll tax. You need to pay a tax in order to vote. If you paid the tax, you voted. If you didn't, you could not vote. So that was the law of states. And that period ran for about 70 plus years. Then the federal government stepped in the 1960s, established a federal voting law to control all 50 states. That was in 1965. And then that period ran for about 50 years, 59 years, and then it had an expiration on that particular public policy, which once it expired, there was a replacement bill to ensure that the federal government continued to regulate voting in America. Well, here's the key, students. The replacement bill passed the House, the Congress, but failed at the Senate, which means, students, there was no federal protection for voting. Which what? The 10th Amendment in the Constitution said pass voting on down to state legislatures. Let 50 states determine their own voting rules. So that's where we are today. The replacement voting bill failed, I believe it was 2021. It failed. 2021, which then opened up the door for states. And that's where we are now related to election laws. Federalism is how government truly works with this passing of responsibility from federal down to states. And states never push it back up. It's always the federal government pushing that legislative decision down to states. So students, I've hit you with enough today. I'm going to come back on Wednesday and I will cover interest groups and types of elections. Okay? So get caught up on your reading. Anyone out there, I know one student sent me a note. You're in the right book. You just got to figure out how to access your chapters. Go to lectures and materials. Again, American government book. You're in the right place. I saw the pictures that you sent, but you just got to figure out how to access those chapters. So students, I'm signing off. Have a great rest of your day. I told you I'd take you about 40 minutes. You're pretty much there right now. So I'm going to end it with this. Follow the same discipline as you did last week. Okay? Let's get through this week together. These weeks are going to start flying by, students. Start taking a look at your syllabus right now to determine when your first exam is. Okay? Because your first exam is approaching. Okay? So get an understanding, kind of start mapping out. And your first exam, I'm going to share with you up front. you will only be responsible for the Texas Constitution chapter, the Texas Political Culture chapter, and this federalism discussion. Okay? So that's only those 3 discussion points, 2 chapter readings, and 1 from the lecture. We just covered federalism. Okay? So those 2 chapter readings, again, Texas Constitution and the Texas Political Culture, and the points I just made regarding federalism. That's all that will be covered on the first exam. Thank you for your attention today. You're doing a great job. Keep taking your notes. Continue to watch these videos. Thank you, students. Take care.